Hi, I'm Lisa Sewell, and I'm the Director of Programming for our Gender and Women's Studies program. And I want to welcome you to this really exciting event today. And before I introduce Anne Kornblut, I just want to alert you to a couple of other Gender and Women's Studies events that are happening soon, so that you can attend those events as well. Two events coming up this month. One is a documentary film called Toomey, The Life and Death of Boitumelo Macallum, which we're co-sponsoring with Africana Studies. And it's a really interesting documentary about this college student in New York who was the victim of domestic violence and murdered by her boyfriend. And it's a film that I saw that I think every college student should see. So I hope you'll come. And the student's mother is going to be here, as well as the filmmaker, to take questions and talk about the film. And that's on Wednesday, October 27th. And then the very next day, on Thursday, October 28th, and the film will be at 7 o'clock in this room. Oh no, it'll be CEER 001. Sorry about that. So 7 o'clock, the 27th. And then the next day we have a student forum, a Gender and Women's Studies student forum, which has been organized by our Gender and the World course, which is our Introduction to Gender and Women's Studies class. And I believe some of the students involved in this event are in the very audience today. We'll have 4 panels that the students have organized, focusing on various topics, hot topics: cyberbullying, teen sex, women's rights, past and present, and women's accomplishments. And I don't know if any of the students who are involved in these panels are here today. Maybe you could raise your hand. And then, if you are interested in finding out a little bit more information about this forum, because it's for students. It's not for professors. It's for students to come and talk about these issues, which are definitely relevant to your lives and our lives. Okay, so those are I don't want to go too far into the future, but those are the upcoming Women's Studies events. And for today, we have Anne Kornblut. She's the White House correspondent for the Washington Post and author of Notes from a Cracked Ceiling: Hillary Clinton, Sarah Palin, and What It Will Take for a Woman to Win. Her book has been widely praised as an important contribution to the investigation into what and how gender means in contemporary politics. It explores the last election with revelations about Clinton and the Palin campaigns and the political landscape for women nationwide. Anne has said that she's going to talk about her book, and she's also going to talk about the current election cycle, which is part of the reason we invited her at this time of year. So she also said that she'd be happy to talk about being the White House correspondent and what that's like, and that she'll take questions after the talk. So I hope you'll join me in welcoming Anne Kornblut.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me okay? Is this microphone working? Can you hear me in the back? Okay. It's deceptively hidden here. You can't tell if it's actually working. I want to start by thanking Lisa and the Gender and Women's Studies program here for having me. You're doing great work in a very important subject area, and you've got great turnout here, which I'm very impressed by, so you're doing something right. And also want to thank you for giving me a chance to play hooky from covering the White House for a day. Obama today is flying out to the West Coast on a very long flight that had a layover in Des Moines, as it turned out. So I got to miss that thanks to you all, and I'm very grateful. I look forward to getting to the talk part, because your questions will be a lot more interesting than having me just stand up here and talk at you. So I hope as I'm talking at you, you can think of some questions that you have about 2008, if you were interested in that, about the current political cycle, as Lisa said, about what it's like to fly on Air Force One, anything that comes to mind. That's my favorite part of doing this, so I'll try and keep my droning on to a minimum. But let me tell you about why I wrote Notes from the Cracked Ceiling. I hadn't really thought a whole lot about gender and politics, I'm sorry to say to the professors in the audience, before I started covering the Clinton campaign in 2008, although I started covering it in 2006, because that's how long the election cycles are these days, because I'd been covering politics for so many years, and I'd been covering men, almost by default. I started covering the Massachusetts congressional delegation, which has never had a woman in it, and I went from there to covering the 2000 presidential campaign, which had no women in it. I covered George Bush's campaign from start to finish. And then in 2004, again, I covered the presidential campaign, which had no women in it. So until I started covering Hillary Clinton in 2006, I'd never actually covered a woman before. And it was the first time I started thinking about gender in politics. And as I started thinking about it and doing some homework in preparation for her run, I noticed an interesting trend, which became a pet peeve of mine, which is that every 2 to 4 years, somewhere in the election cycle, somebody writes that it is the year of the woman. This happened when Geraldine Ferraro ran in 1984. It happened in 1992, which was a big year. Both 1984 was a big year, 1992 was a big year, when the number of women elected to the Senate actually tripled, and 24 new women were elected to the House of Representatives. But we actually saw it again in 2000, when Hillary Clinton went from being First Lady to running for the Senate. That was the year of the woman. And then we saw it again in 2006, when Nancy Pelosi won as House Speaker. And then, of course, we saw it in 2008, when Hillary Clinton ran and Sarah Palin ran, and my own newspaper had a headline that said, "The Year of the Woman," at a moment when it was pretty obvious that they were both going to lose. And it's happening again now, all over the country, as we've all seen, with so many Republican women in particular running for office, and many of them very high profile at this point, and a few of them in states that have never elected a woman before, so there's something to it. And there's no question that at every juncture I've just mentioned, women have made remarkable history, in some cases thanks to the Year of the Woman that came before them, because if you take the 30,000 view foot of history, women are far more integral to the political process now than they were 30 years ago or a century ago. We all know that. And each of these steps has been important in noteworthy and important ways. But calling every year the Year of the Woman, and you'll notice it usually comes with an exclamation point at the end of it, I think does a disservice to voters, especially young voters and young women going out into the real world for the first time. I think it leaves the impression that everything has been solved, or at least that women are on this irreversible upward trajectory, making leaps and bounds every year. And it leaves the impression that women, I think, are on this inevitable march to the White House, and that a female president is right around the corner, maybe next election, maybe the election after that. And that may be true. One of the things you learn as a reporter is not to actually predict what's going to happen, because reporters and pundits are very bad prognosticators. You could, here's a little insider trading for you, you could make a fortune betting against political pundits on the Sunday shows. So I recommend doing that. So I'm not going to be the ones to say to you that Sarah Palin's not going to run in 2012, or that a woman's not going to win in 2012, or a woman's not going to win in 2016. Anything is possible. But all of these high-profile women in politics and candidates we've seen this year and last time and the times before that have blurred the reality, which is that the changes in recent years, and in particular since 1992, have been really incremental. They're very small. In some of the years that some of the groups have declared Year of the Woman, they've said there's a record number of women in the House. That's because one new woman got elected. And now there are 16% of the House is women, and that's the Year of the Woman. So I'm sure you all are familiar, because you're students and you study politics, of the statistics, but I think I'll just remind you that women are a very small proportion of your elected officials. And it's actually plateaued since in recent years, and in some statewide legislatures, some of the numbers have actually gone down in recent years. But in Congress, women are 17%. That's it, 17% of Congress. And that's obviously nowhere near the actual population. Most remarkably of all for me is that this year we may actually see the number of women in Congress drop. and that will be the first time that that's happened in quite some time. And that's because the women who are there, a number of the women are vulnerable, they're Democrats, and they are under siege right now. So we may see that come November 3rd, there's actually fewer than 17% of Congress that's women. And if the Democrats lose control of the House, obviously Nancy Pelosi won't be the Speaker anymore, in which case, and the Republicans do not have any women in their leadership. And so we could actually see it looking less representative than it actually does today. By one measurement, a quarter of the 56 Democratic women in the House, there's 56 Democratic women, 1/4 of them are vulnerable and may lose on November 2nd. So we could see obviously a big change if that were to happen. You know, on the Republican side, there's been a lot of talk about this being the year of the conservative woman, and we won't really know whether that's true, again, until November 2nd. We saw a high percentage of Republican women actually lose their primaries. Those weren't the ones that got the attention, but if you do an analysis of them, there were a lot who ran and a small proportion who won. And some of the Republican women, in fact, many of the Republican women who are now making headlines are not a sure thing at all. Meg Whitman is a little bit behind in California in the governor's race, and we can talk about that race because there's been some provocative things said in that race, as you know. I have a chapter on her, a whole chapter on her in my book. In Nevada, Sharon Ingle is in a dead heat with Harry Reid. In Connecticut, nearby, Linda McMahon is behind Ralph Blumenthal in that Senate race. Nikki Haley, who I'm sure some of you remember being the rising star earlier this year, is in a much closer race for governor of South Carolina than some people had thought. And of course, right next door, Christine O'Donnell is behind Chris Coons. So these are the women making headlines, but to say that they are necessarily going to have a very different makeup in Congress on November 3rd, I think is premature. So all of which is to say, in case I haven't made myself clear, I am not going to call this the year of the woman until we wake up on, unless we wake up on November 3rd and find out there has been some kind of sweep, because in my view, for women just to be in the game is great, but that's not why these women are running it, just so they can say they've tried. They want to win, and that brings me back to 2008, which of course is the subject of my book. Hillary Clinton did not run for president in order to say that she had made history by running for president. I can tell you from watching her up close for all that time. She wanted to win the nomination and the presidency, and all the accolades she has gotten since becoming Secretary of State are heartwarming, I am sure, for her, but they do not erase the fact that she ran and lost, which was really her goal, because not having spoken to her about this exact subject, but having spoken to a lot of people around her, know that she too is of the mind that just trying does not make a year of the woman. What's really remarkable to me about her race, if you think back to the mindset of 2006, which was almost exactly the same place in the presidential cycle that we're in now, 4 years ago, is that Hillary Clinton came into that race as somebody who was inevitable. So some of you are too young to have been really paying attention, so as a refresher, I will tell you, at this exact point 4 years ago, before the race really got into gear, but people were starting to say who's going to run in 2008, Hillary Clinton was the Democratic frontrunner. She was inevitable, and that lasted all the way until the voting started. So for about a year and a half, when people were talking about the election before it actually started happening, she was it. And she had all the fundraising money. She was a juggernaut, and she was not going to be stopped. What was also interesting, though, is that she was very rarely talked about as a woman candidate. Sometimes she was, but more often she was talked about as a former First Lady who was going to run for president, as a Clinton who was going to run for president, as this amazing fundraiser who was going to run for president. And there was a lot of ink spilled asking the question, you know, could the country handle a Clinton dynasty after having had a Bush dynasty? Could they handle having a former president in the Oval Office or near the Oval Office with his wife in office? And I can tell you, as I mentioned before, I covered that campaign from start to finish, which meant 2.5 years of following her on buses and airplanes and to the Iowa State Fair and all over the country. I think 30 states we counted at the end of it, because that primary season went on for so long. And I have to say that her campaign and we in the media who covered her really didn't spend a whole lot of time dwelling on the fact that she was a woman running for president, and she didn't talk about herself that way. In fact, she used to always use the phrase, "I'm not running because I'm a woman." She would start answers to questions that way and would talk about wanting to be a president for all of America, which I think was probably a very wise strategy, but it meant she got a whole host of other questions, including, believe it or not, about whether she was too manly, literally. At one point during the race, Elizabeth Edwards gave an interview about being a woman in a man's profession and saying she could relate to the ways Hillary was because she'd been that too as a lawyer. And the next day on the Drudge Report, in all capital letters, the headline was, "Gender Bender, Wife Edwards says Hillary behaving like a man." And at the next debate that followed, all the candidates, all the Democrats up on stage, Clinton got not one but two questions about whether she was feminine enough. And it didn't really raise any eyebrows. That seemed like a natural question because she had been who she was and because she wasn't running as a woman. Clinton took a pounding in a number of other ways, which I talk about at length in the book, but it really wasn't until voting began that women in the electorate seemed to start to take notice. In particular, the New Hampshire primary, which, as you all know, comes right after the Iowa caucuses. It's one of the two most important days when you're running for your party's nomination. The New Hampshire primary for Hillary Clinton was the moment that the race turned. She didn't know she'd lost yet, none of us did, but this seemed like a moment when she could make her big comeback. And so let me remind you of what happened. She had just lost the Iowa caucuses a few days before, and she raced to New Hampshire, which had been her husband's salvation in 1992, and she hoped it would be her firewall. And she had only a few days of frantic campaigning, and everybody on the campaign plane, including me, had the flu. And that Monday, the day before the primary, she got a question in a coffee shop about how she kept looking so good amid all the chaos. And in answering the question, she choked up. She didn't cry. That's how everyone's talked about it since then. She choked up. And all the men in the cable news started beating her up for it. And John Edwards, who, as you all know, has had his own problems since then, got a question about it and said it wasn't presidential behavior for her to have cried or choked up. And this was a turning point for many women voters who, and maybe some of you remember or knew people who felt differently about Hillary Clinton after that moment. And it's when she really started to be seen as somebody who was running to be not as a woman running for office, but who would represent something important and historic if she did win, because she was experiencing some experiences that women everywhere had had. It's interesting to me now that both she and Palin are in the political mix in such vibrant ways, even having lost, and a testament, I think, to them both of their skills, but also to a hunger in the electorate to see more women running, that neither of them is actively running for anything now, but they still have such influence. As we know, Sarah Palin only has to tweet a random thought and she can move electoral mountains. We see it all the time. Clinton is trying to stay out of the fray of politics, but there have been rumors recently that maybe Joe Biden and she would switch places in 2012, which the White House has said isn't true. But the fact that we're even talking about this question of could Hillary Clinton be on the ticket, would she run in 2016, which is a million years from now, tells you that there's still a hunger, I think, to think about what it would be like to have a woman run, and in the absence of having an actual woman running, to fantasize about who that person might be and to imagine that it might be Hillary Clinton or Sarah Palin. So let me just talk for a minute about some of the phenomenons we saw in 2008 and what I think the next woman who runs, or women who run for president, will have to contend with and think about. It's a short list, it's not comprehensive. Some team, an army of consultants will spend years devising the campaign strategy for this woman, whoever she may be, but these are just a few of the things. The biggest issue, and this is an issue for women who run for city dog catcher and all the way on up, is toughness. I talk about this in the book, and it's really a predicament for women candidates. Voters, for whatever reason, want to know that a woman is going to be tough enough to do whatever the job is. This is especially true in executive type jobs like governor and president. And when it comes to the presidency, they want to know, is this woman going to be able to stand up to Congress? Is she going to be able to stand up to foreign leaders? Is she going to be able to stand up to the other party, because we don't like them very much? They want to know that she's going to be tough. The first question Hillary Clinton ever got when she went out on the campaign trail in Iowa in 07 was, how are you going to be able to deal with bad men? And she made a joke that we all thought was about her husband, but she said, I know something about bad men. And people laughed. But it was a real, but the voter wanted to know, what are you going to do about Ahmadinejad? You know, what do you do about North Korea? And that is a real question that even somebody like Hillary Clinton, who I think people know, she was so tough that she may have been over the top. People knew she was tough, but they still wanted to know, could she do that? And I heard from so many women who've run for Congress or for Senate, especially for governor, that that is their biggest hurdle. And even though Hillary Clinton seemed to go overboard with the toughness, you know, voting for the Iraq War, which was part of her presidential strategy, being on the Senate Armed Services Committee, which was also part of her thinking through looking at reams of polling data and saying, okay, what am I going to do to overcome this #1 question of toughness? Even though she may have gone overboard with it, it still remains a question for the next person. And whatever you think about Sarah Palin, whatever some of her shortcomings as a candidate may be, she's also shown her toughness, and her resilience is part of her shtick. And Nancy Pelosi, too. For the ones who are very successful, they have some kind of exterior, and they all do it in slightly different ways. But I don't think we're going to see a shrinking violet or someone who's especially delicate doing well, a woman doing especially well, running for that kind of higher office. And it's interesting this year because some of the female candidates seem to know this instinctively, for better or for worse. I'm sure you've all seen the recent use of the phrase "man up" in some of these races. If you haven't, I will tell you a little bit about what we've heard. There was a debate in Nevada in the Senate race I think it was just last week, in fact, where the Republican woman who's running, Sharon Angle, told Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid that he needed to man up on Social Security and the way he talks about Social Security. Before that, Christine O'Donnell, right next door, had called Mike Castle, who she was running against in the Republican primary, unmanly, and because he had filed an elections complaint against her. And her full quote, which I'm going to read to you because I love it so much, was, "This is not a bake-off. Get your man pants on." Get your man pants on. Elsewhere, in Colorado, we saw Republican Jane Norton challenging her rival in the Senate primary, Ken Buck, who went on to win, to be man enough to admit that he was behind some of his advertising. And we've even seen some men using this phrasing. In the New York governor's race, Carl Palladino accused the Democrat Andrew Cuomo of not having the cojones to debate him, which is something Sarah Palin had said about Barack Obama a couple months ago, saying he didn't have the cojones to talk about illegal immigration. And so, you know, apart from being a little crass and silly and kind of controversial, I think that the candidates would need to have male qualities in order to be seen as being worth anything. Beyond that, I think what that tells you is that the man-up debate tells us is that the guy traits are still dominant in politics, and ones that female candidates see as important. And while that may be regrettable and unfair, it's the fact of life for women who are running. And so that is to say that I still think toughness will be the biggest issue for the next woman or women who run. And it's why we see so many women who are prosecutors running for office, and who I think that law enforcement could potentially be a field where we see a future female president come from. Another lesson from 2008 is that for women, and this is going to fall into the category of, again, like not fair, but that's the way things are, is that for women, your family still matters. And I would put it up there with looks and haircuts and other things that are double standards for women who run, but it's just simply true. It's diminishing a little bit. Some of the looks issues, in fact, are becoming a little more equal because male candidates are now coming under scrutiny for what they're wearing and their haircuts, so it's a little even now. But when it comes to families, women who run, their husbands and their children are under a lot of scrutiny. You know, we thought when Hillary Clinton was running that we were paying too much attention to Bill Clinton for the obvious reason, which was he was a former president, and former two-term president. And so, and he was talking a lot, and it seemed like that was a natural development, but if you look at a lot of Senate races and then you look at Sarah Palin, it doesn't have to be a husband who's done anything in particular for them to get a lot of attention, and certainly children who've done nothing can get attention too. We saw it most recently in California, as some of you may know. Meg Whitman, who's running for governor, former chairman of eBay, had some trouble with some household help that turned out to be illegal. And she came under a lot of fire for that, but so did her husband. Her husband's a neurosurgeon, and one of the most recent attacks has been, well, it's one thing to understand that Meg Whitman didn't see this, but her husband's a neurosurgeon. How did he not see it? Which, given that she had run such a big corporation and is, in fact, a billionaire by her own worth, seemed funny. But that's the reality for women running, is that these are questions they're going to have to handle. And while we've seen in some races that complaints work, women can say that's a double standard, they only work so much. And women candidates have told me they're very reluctant to talk too much about what they think is unfair, because voters don't want whiners. They want people who are going to go out and solve problems, which requires a great deal of fortitude for women who are running to have to just kind of lump it and take it and move on. One final lesson that I'm going to talk to you about is from Palin's candidacy, and that has to do with female voters. It's also relevant this year. Some of you will remember that when Palin was picked, her team said, this is going to appeal to women voters nationwide. And one of her first speeches that she gave, she said something to the effect of, Hillary Clinton had put 18 million cracks in the glass ceiling, the highest, hardest glass ceiling, because that's how many votes she got. And the women of the United States are not done yet, implying that she was going to pick up right where Hillary Clinton had left off. This, as we know, turned out not to be the case. And the truth is that was utterly predictable. If the McCain campaign had bothered to ask around before they picked her. As a side note, I don't know how many of you know this, but Sarah Palin was picked without the advice of any women. There were 4, maybe 5 men on the campaign who picked her, and they didn't ask any of the senior women, no Republican women, no women, not Cindy McCain, nobody, before they picked her. And there were some mistakes I think they could have avoided if they had just consulted somebody to say, like, hey, do you think this is going to work? In any case, as the political scientists folks here in the room know, gender has not ever been a very good predictor of whether someone's going to switch their vote. Women tend to be more democratic. In recent decades, women have just trended democratic, but they do not vote for candidates just because they're women. Democratic women do not cross the aisle very often to vote for Republican women. Republican women do not cross the aisle very often to vote for Democratic women. All you can see it do in most cases is exaggerate what they would have done anyway, so that if there's a Democratic female candidate, Democratic women who already feel Democratic are drawn to her in even bigger numbers, and it's helpful for her to win. On the Republican side, Republican women often get more Republican men voting for them, more men in general voting for them, than they do women. That has just been the breakdown. So it was pretty foolish for the McCain campaign to think that this was going to make a big difference, and in fact, in the end, it didn't. And for the first time in several years, several presidential cycles, the vice presidential nominee actually was a little bit of a drag on the ticket. You don't normally see that. Usually the vice president is kind of an afterthought. Doesn't help, doesn't hurt. And in this case, she hurt. It was only a little bit, but it was notable that it hurt. And I want to finish by talking about younger voters. I talk about this too in the book, but what we saw in 2008, and I heard it from my friends, was that younger women, and depending on how you look at politics, younger women can be women 35 and younger. It's not just college-age women. Do not think that they should be making voting decisions based on gender. And they did not think, given how far we've come as a society, that women having women on the Supreme Court, women secretaries of state, 3 of them now, as business leaders, they do not think that it was that big a deal to elect a woman president. And certainly not when they were faced with the choice between electing an African American or electing a woman. What we heard from so many of them was that it was just not as historic in their minds. And I think in part that's because they, and I was raised this way too, but they had been raised in a world where every year is the year of the woman. And so why would it be a big deal? But I think that's a big challenge for the next woman who runs for president. Hillary Clinton had a really hard time convincing young women that it would matter. She took it for granted. She just assumed young women would rally around her. And in fact, at her own college, she went to Wellesley, all-women's school, and the head of the Wellesley Democrats, obviously a woman, switched from supporting Hillary early on to supporting Obama because she just felt like it was a bigger deal. And that Hillary Clinton wasn't able to keep the head of the college Democrats at Wellesley on board, I think tells you the kind of challenge she was up against. And I think that's going to be true for whatever woman who runs. Because women are different across generations. There is not some collective woman's vote. And women candidates who take that for granted, be it Hillary Clinton or Sarah Palin, do so at their peril. So let me just close by saying this and then look forward to taking your questions. As I mentioned, I'm here on furlough from my day job, and I've been covering politics since 1998 when I was sent to Washington. I worked for the Boston Globe, and they sent me down to their Washington bureau to cover the Monica Lewinsky scandal, and I said to myself at that time, I am never going to cover another story as mind-blowing as this one. And then just 2 years later, I covered the Bush campaign, and there was the recount that went on for a month when we didn't know who was going to be the president. And that was pretty mind-blowing, and I said, okay, I can quit now. That's it. That's the biggest story I'm ever going to cover. And then after that, 9/11 happened, and then the Iraq War, and then the 2008 campaign, which was an incredible thing to watch up close. And so I've stopped saying that any story I've covered is my best or my last best, all of which is to say that for my skepticism in talking about what it will take for a woman to become president and women in politics generally, I do think we will yet have a woman in the White House someday, and I might even still be around to cover it, but I don't think it's going to happen by accident, and if it does happen, it will be because thoughtful audiences like you all have thought about it and kept the conversation alive, so I appreciate your doing that. And with that, I want to solicit questions from some of you in the audience. Don't be shy. Oh, that's nice too. Thank you.